Hello, welcome to Galaxy Dungeon. Over the last year and a half, I've made videos on some of the JRPGs of the original Nintendo era. Through this era, JRPGs were in their infancy, so these dungeons are the first to bring the idea of dungeons from tabletop RPGs and computer games to console for a broader audience. They had inconsistent success with the 5 aspects that make a dungeon special. These first dungeons were very simplistic, but were more sprawling and complex than some of the ones nowadays. So here's my top 10 list ranking the top 10 greatest dungeons from the 8-bit JRPG era. They're ranked by 5 categories: complexity, monsters, puzzles, traps, and their appearance. Number 10, Sunken Shrine. The Sunken Shrine is one of the dungeons of the original Final Fantasy. It's underwater and is the home of the mermaids, which have been taken over by the Kraken, one of the 4 fiends. The Kraken corrupted a water crystal, and the seas have been raging ever since. The player enters this dungeon to defeat the Kraken and restore the water crystal. This dungeon has a lot of dead ends, separate paths, and NPCs. It's one of the more sprawling and non-linear dungeons. Also, most of the monsters are water-themed, which makes more sense as it's underwater, and they're at a more reasonable power level than some of the other dungeons in this one. Plus, the different levels of the dungeon have different water tints, which makes them easier to distinguish. Number 9, Mount Golg. Mount Golg is the 3rd major dungeon of Final Fantasy. It's a lava dungeon set in a volcano where the player searches for the fire crystal so they can restore it. It's very sprawling and complex. It's full of dead ends and lava traps all over it, and has a large variety of monsters. However, not all of them are themed after fire. If you want to get out alive, you'll have to be very careful and choose the right places to go over lava rocks rather than sticking to walkways full of monsters. The final boss is one of the most powerful of the 4 fiends of the game. Luckily, there's a lot of treasure, which is pretty well distributed, and all the floors are different from each other. Number 8, Sistern Chapel. The Sistern Chapel is an optional dungeon in Dragon Quest IV. It's a temple full of waterways the player has to navigate on boat in some sections. They also have to solve a puzzle to raise and lower the water level. It has some cool monsters. Some of them are insects, some are water themed, and some are just common monsters. During Chapter 3, the player enters it to retrieve a silver statuette. Due to its puzzles, it earns a spot on this list. Number 7, Rosa Mar Manor. Rosa Mar Manor is a dungeon in Earthbound Beginnings. It's a haunted house. It only has 3 monsters, but they're all themed after the dungeon, and it's reasonably difficult. It's pretty complex and will send the player around in circles. It's also named after a classic horror film called Rosemary's Baby. The only catch is that a lot of the rooms look basically the same and appear to be floating in a void. Number 6, Tower of Garuna. The Tower of Garuna is an optional dungeon in Dragon Quest III. The player enters it to find a book they can use to upgrade one of their own to the Sage class, the most powerful class in the game. It's pretty complex, and the monsters and appearance is pretty average. However, it has traps to fall through and tight ropes to go over. Plus, there's a bunch of portals to shake things up. Number 5, Zoma's Castle. Zoma's Castle is the final dungeon of Dragon Quest III. This dungeon is actually in all 3 games of the first Dragon Quest trilogy. However, in the 3rd game, it's shown in its original form, and due to more experience by the developers and company, it's a lot more advanced than the previous versions. It's also known as the Charlock Castle in some Old English localizations. It combines the best of the dungeons in the first 2 games, giving it a lot of puzzles, traps, and monsters, and the graphics are pretty good compared to JRPG Dungeons at the time. It also includes an epic boss gauntlet at the end. Number 4, Castle Nadera. Castle Nadera is the final dungeon of the 4th Dragon Quest game. It's in the center of the underworld Nadera. It's full of puzzles, traps, monsters, and has a decent appearance. Plus, it has some sections outside and some on the inside. Plus, the monsters have a more Asian appearance rather than medieval European. It leads to a mountain where the main villain resides. However, it's not as complex as a lot of the dungeons on this list. Number 3, Tower of Rubis. Back in Dragon Quest III, the Tower of Rubis is a large tower dungeon full of traps and different paths to take. It ultimately leads up to the top floor where the player encounters the mythical being Rubis, who is the creator of the realm of Alifgard, where this tower resides. It introduces a new floor puzzle which sets up their inclusion in the final dungeon, Zoma's Castle. However, the floors are awfully similar to each other. Number 2, Medicean Tower. Medicean Tower is a dungeon in Final Fantasy II. It's the largest dungeon in the entire game. Only one other dungeon rivals it. The player enters it to unseal a spell called Ultima. That spell has become a reoccurring spell in the series, and this dungeon was its first appearance. Every floor has a different aesthetic based on the classical elements. It's sprawling with monsters and treasure. Plus, there's a bunch of different mini-bosses leading up to an ice dragon at the end of the 10th floor. It's really tall, and there's fire and ice traps. Plus, all the floors are different, as they each represent different elements. The monsters and bosses are also different, as they're based on the elements too. Before we reveal our number 1 pick, here are some honorable mentions. The Sea Cave in Dragon Quest II, the Flying Fortress in Final Fantasy, and the Shrine of the Colossus in Dragon Quest IV. Number 1. The Pyramid. The Pyramid is one of the dungeons of Dragon Quest III. It's a puzzle dungeon set in a location of the game that's deliberately made to feel like Egypt. Plus, all the monsters are specifically themed for this dungeon. The traps are more interesting, including a basement where spells are nullified. This makes the game a lot more challenging, and it has well-distributed treasure, and on top of that, it's very complex. Overall, this dungeon is so phenomenal that I created an entire video about it. The Pyramid well deserves the title of the greatest JRPG dungeon of the 8-bit era. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Have a wonderful day.